Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, at my dad's birthday, every single person in that room had a gift bag waiting for them, except me. I am not exaggerating or being dramatic when I say it hit me like a brick to the chest, because in that moment, it was not about the bag itself, but about what it represented. That silent, deliberate exclusion everyone could see, but nobody acknowledged. I sat down, I smiled politely, and I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach, but all I could think was how many times I had quietly paid for things behind the scenes, how many emergencies I had stepped in to fix, and yet here I was, the only one who didn't get a token of appreciation at my own father's celebration. You might wonder why I didn't just call it out right there. Why not say, "Hey, where's mine?" But you know how families are in my family. Speaking up only makes you the villain. My sister Lindsay would have turned it into a joke, Dad would have lowered his eyes, and the whole room would have decided I was making trouble again. So instead of handing them that script, I did something different. I waited until the laughter got loud enough, then I leaned over, pulled out my phone, and snapped one photo of the table lined with bags. I didn't even bother framing it perfectly, I just wanted the evidence. I slipped the phone back into my purse, stood up, and told Dad I wasn't feeling well. He gave me a half-hearted nod without meeting my eyes, and I walked out before anyone could stop me. On the drive home, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Not because I was sad, I had passed sad years ago, but because I realized how predictable this all was. This was not the first time Lindsay had orchestrated something to leave me out while making herself look generous, but it was the first time I wasn't going to just swallow it. I started scrolling through my phone, looking at all the receipts I had saved from covering utilities when Dad's bills fell behind, the pharmacy payments I had made when Lindsay forgot to pick up his medication, the rideshare confirmations when I arranged transportation because she was too busy. I had a folder full of proof, and for once, I decided I was going to use it. When I got home, I sat on the couch in complete silence, staring at that photo of the gift bags. It wasn't even dramatic, just rows of little bags with names written on tags, every name except mine. That one empty space where mine should have been said more than words ever could. I uploaded the photo to the family group chat, no caption, no explanation, just the image. Within minutes, I saw the three dots dancing, relatives typing, stopping, deleting, starting again. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Aunt Carol replied with, "Oh honey, I'm sure it was just a mistake," but even in text, I could hear the discomfort dripping through. I typed back, "No mistake. I'm done funding family events that I'm excluded from." And I hit send before I could second-guess myself. That line, short, direct, undeniable, was the first boundary I had ever drawn with them, and I could feel the ripple hit instantly. Lindsay left the chat without a word. My cousin Mike texted me privately saying, "About time you said something." Dad didn't respond at all. But what shocked me was Aunt Carol calling me 10 minutes later, her voice shaking. She said, "If they knew how much you've carried all these years, they'd be ashamed. I always wondered why you seemed tired all the time." That was the first moment I realized maybe I wasn't crazy for feeling used. As the night went on, my phone kept buzzing. Some messages were supportive, some were defensive, and some were just silence that spoke louder than words. But here's the part that flipped everything. I hadn't even shared the real story yet. All I had done was post a picture and a single sentence, and already the cracks in their perfect facade were starting to show. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand, not because I yelled, not because I fought, but because I had proof and I had finally decided to stop protecting their image at my own expense. What none of them realized was that the photo was just the beginning. That was my opening move, and it was enough to get them rattled. But I had something far stronger in my back pocket, years of receipts, documents, and even voice memos that told the real story of who kept this family afloat. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative one more time. So when Aunt Carol whispered on the phone, "If only they knew what you actually do," I smiled for the first time that day. I told her, "Don't worry, they're about to." And as I hung up, I started organizing everything on my laptop into a neat folder with one title, "Things You Asked Me to Keep Quiet." They wanted me invisible. Instead, I was about to become unforgettable. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was still buzzing with unread messages, some of them full of excuses, some filled with silence, and a few containing the kind of half-hearted apologies that carry no weight. The sort that people write not because they feel remorse, but because they feel exposed. I sat there in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and realized that for the first time in years I had the advantage, not because I had yelled louder or played into their drama, but because I had something far more powerful than words: receipts, records, and undeniable proof. For years my role in the family had been that of the invisible backbone, the person who quietly covered expenses, picked up responsibilities, and made sure the lights stayed on without anyone giving me credit. But now that same history was about to become my strongest weapon. I opened my laptop and created a shared album with a title that made even me smirk: Things You Asked Me to Keep Quiet. Into that folder I dropped screenshots of utility bills where my name appeared as the payer month after month, long after Lindsay had promised she would handle it. I added confirmation emails from the pharmacy showing how I had refilled Dad's prescriptions when someone forgot or was too busy, along with the rideshare records proving that it was me arranging and paying for his trips to medical appointments, while everyone else was too preoccupied with appearances. I even included a scanned image of the cashier's check I had handed over for the birthday party deposit, the very event where I was the only one excluded from receiving a gift bag. Each file was labeled with a date and a simple description, so no one could claim confusion, no one could twist the story, and no one could minimize my role anymore. The more I compiled, the calmer I felt, because for once I was not depending on anyone's version of events or anyone's memory of what happened. I had facts, and facts, unlike my family's stories, have no feelings and no bias. Alongside the financial records, I included a voice memo Dad had left me earlier that year where he admitted, in his own tired words, "Kiddo, please handle the forms. Your sister gets overwhelmed." I remember listening to that voicemail the first time and feeling nothing but exhaustion, but now, in the context of everything else, it was validation I had never received. I decided to keep it short and simple, not an essay, not a rant, just a neat package of evidence that no one could ignore. When it was ready, I selected a small, deliberate list of recipients: Dad, Lindsay, Aunt Carol, my cousin Mike, and Ms. Whitaker, Dad's attorney who had quietly handled his legal documents earlier in the year. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone in public. I wasn't posting this online. I wasn't looking for pity from strangers. I was simply sending the truth to the people who mattered, and by doing so, I stripped Lindsay of her favorite defense, which was painting me as unstable, dramatic, or ungrateful. I attached a short message: transparency going forward. I will no longer fund anything I am excluded from. All requests must be written. All payments must go through the trust or not at all. Then I hit send, closed the laptop, and waited. The reactions came fast and uneven. Aunt Carol replied almost immediately with a message that began with "Oh my God" and ended with a long apology for not realizing how much I had done. Mike sent me a text with nothing but the words, "Finally. They can't spin this now." Lindsay, on the other hand, stayed silent for a while, then eventually left me a voice note dripping with indignation, accusing me of weaponizing paperwork and making the family look bad. I listened once and then deleted it, because what she called weaponizing I called protecting myself, and what she labeled as betrayal was nothing more than me refusing to carry her burdens in secret any longer. The most important message, though, came from Ms. Whitaker. Her email was brief, but carried the kind of precision that only an attorney could deliver. "Aaron, since financial transparency is now in discussion, it is appropriate for me to circulate the documents your father executed earlier this spring." That one sentence was like a thunderclap in the middle of a storm, because it meant the conversation was no longer just about me paying bills or Lindsay arranging gift bags. It was about the actual legal framework that Dad had put in place, the one that none of them could argue away. I sat there staring at that email and knew this was only the beginning. If the photo had rattled them and the receipts had cracked the walls, then the legal papers Ms. Whitaker was about to share would demolish the entire story Lindsay had been building for years. For so long, she had controlled the narrative by silencing me, by casting me as difficult, by spinning everything to make herself look like the saint who carried the family. But now there was hard evidence, real signatures, and official language that told the truth in a way she couldn't twist. As the group chat lit up with speculation, questions, and passive-aggressive comments, I poured myself another cup of coffee and leaned back in my chair. For years, I had been the one chasing their approval, doing the invisible work, and swallowing my resentment. Now, for the first time, they were the ones scrambling to explain themselves, and I hadn't even raised my voice. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to. The truth, laid out neatly in files and folders, was louder than any argument I could ever make. The night before, I had walked out of that party feeling small and forgotten. Now, less than 24 hours later, I realized I had shifted the entire balance of power without shouting, without begging, without even leaving my house. All it took was finally refusing to keep their secrets. And as I watched the dots bounce in the group chat, signaling that Lindsay was typing another long message, I couldn't help but think to myself, this is only the second move, and already they don't know how to respond. What none of them knew yet was that Ms. Whitaker's email was not just a warning shot, it was the doorway to the next step, the release of legal documents that would make every denial, every excuse, and every attempt to gaslight me irrelevant. They wanted me silent and compliant. Instead, I had chosen to speak the one language they couldn't argue with, the truth written on paper. And once those documents landed, there would be no going back. When Ms. Whitaker's email arrived with a subject line that felt both clinical and merciless, I opened it expecting formality and found, instead, the kind of clarity that slices through years of family noise. Because attached were the documents my father had executed in the spring, the revocable trust with equal distribution, the healthcare directive naming me as primary and Lindsay as secondary, and a short letter in his own handwriting that explained his reasoning without blaming anyone, which said, in careful language and tired pen strokes, that he had chosen me for first position because I keep records and follow through, not because he loves me more. And that he wanted transparency going forward so that no one would be accused unfairly or burdened in secret. As I scrolled through the pages, I felt that strange combination of relief and grief that shows up when the truth finally sticks to something solid, because although I had known about these documents, seeing them shared to the same people who had pretended I was reckless or dramatic changed the air in the room, and by room, I mean the group thread that had been vibrating with denials and platitudes all morning, since now every message would be read under the light of signatures, witness lines, and notarized seals that do not care about tone or popularity, or who brought the prettiest cake. Ms. Whitaker's cover note was brief and bloodless. Per Mr. Harold's request at execution, the enclosed may be circulated to relevant family upon material dispute regarding finances or care. Please reply with any questions. There was nothing to fight in that sentence, and that was the point. Aunt Carol responded first, not with a speech but with a quiet, "I am sorry for not asking questions sooner," which landed heavier than any accusation because it admitted what most people in our family never say out loud, that they believe the loudest person until the receipts are set in front of them, and then they believe the paper. My cousin Mike replied a few minutes later with a single line that made me breathe easier than I had in months. This explains everything we have seen for years. Lindsay, of course, did not respond with words anyone could keep. She sent a long voice message that I did not finish, accusing me of staging a takeover, of twisting Dad against her, of weaponizing paperwork again. And I let it trail into silence because it was the same song she always sings when control slips, when the story stops being hers to perform and becomes something measured, dated, and auditable. I wrote one sentence back, and even as I typed it I felt the weight shift. Paperwork is how adults remember what they agreed to. Then, without ceremony, I logged into the utility portals I had been covering for months, turned off the automatic payments that had kept the lights on without thanks, and forwarded the providers the trust's billing instructions that Ms. Whitaker had authorized, copying Lindsay so there would be no confusion about who would handle what from this day forward, making it explicit that any expense outside the trust required written approval, that any "I forgot" or "I am too busy" would no longer be subsidized by my patients, and that if someone failed to plan, The consequence would be a bill in their own inbox rather than a late-night text to me. The feeling that followed was not vindictive, and it was not spiteful. It was clean, like wiping down a counter that has been sticky for too long. Because all I had done was move responsibility back to the people who claimed it in public while handing it to me in private, and if that made the group chat uncomfortable, then maybe discomfort is what happens when the truth finally sits down next to you and refuses to get up. Dad called me then, his voice raspy with the effort of choosing words that would not explode, saying he had not realized how much I was still paying, saying he thought we had figured out a system, saying he did not want to make things worse, and I told him, as gently as I could while staring at the list of debits on my screen, that the system was me, and that the system had resigned. It would be nice to say that this is when Lindsay softened or apologized or even just went quiet, but she did not. Instead, she tried to reframe the entire conversation as an attack on her confidence, which would have worked in any past year when everything lived in the shadows of "do not tell anyone," except now the documents sat in the thread like a referee who does not care about anyone's feelings, and even Aunt Carol, who is constitutionally unable to take sides, wrote that the only fair way forward is to follow what Dad signed and to treat me not as the family wallet, but as the person entrusted to ensure that rules are followed. I was about to put my phone down when an unknown number flashed on the screen, and the voice on the other end introduced himself from the bank's fraud and security team, asking to confirm whether certain cash withdrawals on Dad's account the previous month were expected, listing several round amounts from weekends that matched the dates of party planning and errand days, which froze me because I do not hold his debit card and I do not withdraw cash for him, and while the man did not accuse anyone of anything, the questions themselves detonated across the family chat once I relayed them, since they hung in the air like a bell nobody wanted to claim they rang. Lindsay said it must be a mistake, that Dad probably forgot he took the money out himself, that banks are always confused, but Dad, to his credit, whispered that he rarely uses cash because it makes tracking difficult. And he asked the representative to send the branch footage for verification, which he could do because Ms. Whitaker had already updated his account permissions when the trust was executed. Another small detail that looked boring until it was the only thing that mattered. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that forms when the story can no longer be spun, when the thread count of a lie is visible to the touch. I did not gloat, and I did not grandstand. I simply wrote that I would await the bank's follow-up and, in the meantime, that all future expenses tied to Dad's care would go through the trust with receipts attached, and that any social events would be funded by whoever chose to host them, and then I closed the thread because I had work to do and a life to live that did not revolve around managing other people's optics. As I shut the laptop, I realized how strange it felt to breathe without that old weight on my chest, and how different my house sounded when my phone was not vibrating with new demands, and how, for the first time since I can remember, I was not afraid of the next group message because whatever it said would have to answer to something stronger than anyone's opinion. The documents had spoken, the payments had stopped, the bank had started asking questions, and all I had done was step out of the role I never volunteered for, which meant the next move would not be a tantrum or a plea, but something quieter and more final. The kind of decision that does not need permission because it is funded by my own backbone and my own money, and as I thought about that, I realized there was one last thing I needed to send in the morning, not a threat, not a smear, but an announcement that would take all the energy I used to spend keeping peace and convert it into something that actually helps someone, and that, more than anything, would end the game Lindsay has been playing for years. The so-called family meeting was not my idea, and if I had been given a choice, I would have preferred to continue sending neat, controlled messages with attachments that spoke louder than voices, but Ms. Whitaker insisted that a direct conversation, recorded and archived, would prevent misunderstandings later, which was her polite way of saying that too many people in my family had built their reputations on convenient memory lapses. So when the video call began and I saw every small square light up, Dad's tired face, Aunt Carol's anxious eyes, Mike's steady stare, and Lindsay's theatrical smile that never quite reached her eyes, I knew that whatever happened next would not be forgotten. because for the first time, there was nowhere to run. Ms. Whitaker opened with the same calm neutrality that made her so effective, stating that the trust documents and billing records were now public among the family, that certain questions had been raised about cash withdrawals, and that going forward, all decisions must align with the signed directives. She spoke like a surgeon cutting away infected tissue, efficient and without embellishment, and while she spoke, I noticed how Dad kept fiddling with his glasses as if hoping the frames might shield him from the confrontation. I stayed silent, because silence has power when you have already set the table with evidence. When it was Lindsay's turn, she launched into the kind of monologue I had heard my whole life, filled with phrases like miscommunication, I was under the impression, and you know how overwhelmed I get. Each one crafted to sound helpless rather than calculating, as though pretending to be the family's victim might disguise the fact that she had lived comfortably off my invisible labor for years. But this time, her performance landed flat, because Ms. Whitaker interrupted to ask her directly whether she disputed the payments shown, whether she denied that I had covered medical costs, and whether she objected to the trust's equal distribution clause. Faced with questions that required yes or no answers, her long speeches shrank into mutters and deflections, and the contrast between her theatrics and the paperwork in front of us became impossible to ignore. Then Mr. Patel, the office manager from Dad's clinic whom Ms. Whitaker had invited, spoke up in the same tone he used when explaining billing policies, describing in plain detail how many times I had called to authorize refills, how often I had paid from my own account when deadlines approached, and how my consistency was the only reason Dad never missed his prescriptions. There was no anger in his voice, no exaggeration, just the kind of bureaucratic clarity that carries more force than shouting, and in that moment, the years of dismissal I had endured turned to dust. Lindsay shifted in her chair, her smile cracking as she realized the witnesses she had never accounted for were now speaking, and their words carried more weight than any accusation I could have made. Finally, Dad cleared his throat and said, with visible strain, that he had asked me to handle things quietly because he hated conflict, that he thought he was protecting peace by hiding who carried the weight, and that he never intended for it to become a weapon against me. Hearing him admit that both softened and hardened me, because while I understood his avoidance, I also recognized how much damage it had done, not just to me, but to the entire family dynamic that revolved around silence and appearances. I told him calmly, in front of everyone, that I would no longer be the silent engine keeping things running, that if he wanted peace it would have to be earned through honesty, not through my exhaustion, and that from this moment forward, if I was excluded as a family member, I would not participate as the checkbook. The silence that followed was heavy, because even Lindsay, who never stops filling space, had nothing to say. Aunt Carol nodded slowly, as if she had finally let herself admit what she had suspected for years, and Mike simply leaned forward into the camera with that look of satisfaction people get when justice finally lands. It was not triumphant in a loud way. It was quiet, steady, and irreversible. I ended the meeting by announcing, without drama, that there was one final message scheduled for the next morning, an announcement I had prepared not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because I was done pouring energy into keeping a peace that never protected me. I told them it was not an attack, not a smear, but a decision, and that they would see exactly what I meant at 8 o'clock sharp. The look on Lindsay's face when I said that, half panic, half calculation, was almost enough to satisfy me, but I knew the true satisfaction would come with the final step, the move that would redefine everything they thought they could demand from me. As I closed the call and the screen went black, I felt something I had not felt in years: control. Not the brittle, exhausting control of keeping everyone else afloat, but the calm control of someone who no longer hides what they do, who no longer apologizes for refusing to be used, and who understands that revenge does not have to be loud to be devastating. The next morning would prove it, and whether they hated me for it or finally respected me, it would not matter, because the decision was mine, and the consequences were theirs to carry. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, while the house was still quiet and the air carried that tense calm that comes before a storm, I pressed send on the message I had scheduled. And in that instant, the story my family had been clinging to for years shattered in a way that could never be glued back together. The announcement was not dramatic in tone and not written to provoke pity. It was clear, structured, and undeniable. I explained that from this point forward, I would no longer serve as the invisible wallet or the silent safety net, because I had redirected the money I usually spent patching their gaps into something permanent and verifiable. A scholarship fund at Dad's clinic, created in Mom's name, to support caregivers who often work long hours without recognition. I included the confirmation email from the clinic's finance department, the signed agreement that made the fund official, and the first report of deposits already transferred. In one stroke, I turned years of secret labor into a legacy that could not be erased, controlled, or twisted into gossip. The reactions began pouring in almost immediately. Aunt Carol called me within 10 minutes, her voice thick with emotion as she admitted that she felt both ashamed and relieved. Ashamed because she had let herself believe the narratives Lindsay spun, and relieved because someone had finally broken the cycle of silence. She told me Mom would have been proud, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something other than resentment when I heard her voice. Mike sent me a blunt text that made me laugh out loud in the kitchen. Best move you've ever made. They'll choke on this. His words, short but sharp, captured exactly what I wanted, not vengeance in the form of cruelty, but a clean severing of the leash they had looped around my neck for years. Dad, however, took longer to respond, and when his message finally arrived, it was not in the group thread, but in a private text that I will never forward or post, because it was not meant to be a weapon. He wrote, "You were right. I leaned on you too much. I want to do better with the time I have left." That single acknowledgement carried more weight than every empty thank you I had received in the past, because it admitted fault without excuses, and it opened the door to something I had stopped believing was possible. The chance for a relationship not built on me carrying his burdens in secret. Lindsay's silence stretched for hours, and though I pretended not to care, I kept checking the thread, half expecting her to launch another tirade about betrayal, or to call me selfish in the way she always does when her grip on control loosens. But instead, late in the afternoon, one line appeared without preamble. "I am returning the event card to Dad's trust account." No apology, no acknowledgement, no admission of what she had done, just a single act that confirmed the inevitable. She had been stripped of control. It was not satisfying in the loud, cinematic way some people imagine revenge should be, but it was more powerful than anything else she could have said, because in that single sentence she admitted defeat without daring to say the words out loud. The group chat, which had once been a stage for her theatrics, became strangely quiet after that. Aunt Carol shared a prayer about family unity, Mike replied with a sardonic comment that made me smirk, and Dad typed a short thank you that carried more sincerity than I had ever seen from him in public. Nobody dared to attack me, nobody tried to reframe the story, because the truth was no longer debatable. The fund existed, the documents were signed, the utilities were off my back, and the trust instructions were now public. The game they had played for years, where Lindsay performed generosity while I provided it, was dead. What surprised me most was how I felt once the dust settled. I had expected triumph to feel fiery, like winning an argument or slamming a door, but instead it felt steady and cool, like setting down a heavy box you had been carrying too long. I was not gloating, and I was not replaying their reactions for pleasure. I was simply breathing easier, because for the first time, the roles were no longer rigged against me. I was not the difficult one, the dramatic one, or the ungrateful one. I was the one who finally said no, who finally documented the truth, and who finally redirected energy into something lasting rather than something that only fed appearances. As evening approached, I added one final entry to the shared album, the same one that had started this spiral. On one side of the image, I placed the original photo of the gift bags lined neatly on the table with my name conspicuously missing, and beside it, the confirmation email from the clinic announcing the first scholarship recipient who would receive support because of the fund in Mom's name. I captioned it with a single line, "If I am left out of the party, I will build a better room." That was the closest thing to gloating I allowed myself, but it was also a statement of truth, because I no longer wanted a seat at their table if it required me to keep paying for the food while being treated like a stranger. That night, I put my phone face down and allowed myself the rare luxury of peace. They could scramble, they could whisper, they could try to rewrite history again, but it would not matter, because the truth was no longer a secret I carried alone. The scholarship existed, the trust documents were unshakable, and the evidence of years of labor was now archived in a place where no one could pretend it had not happened. My revenge was not fire and fury, it was control, clarity, and permanence. And though I knew there would still be fallout, tension, and the awkward weight of family gatherings in the future, I also knew that the balance had shifted forever, and for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of the silence that followed. I had won not by playing their game, but by ending it entirely.